It began with a single word, burned into parchment, hidden within a chamber beneath the Judean desert. Zephon, not in any known dialect of Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. And yet, scholars at the dig site recognized its implications instantly. Dr. Elias Mercer had seen many forgeries in his 3-decade career, but this scroll, discovered inside a sealed jar beneath Khirbet Qumran, was different. The ink hadn't aged, the parchment hadn't decayed, and the language, ancient yet somehow living. As he held the artifact under the dull glow of his excavation lamp, the air around him grew thick, oppressively quiet. Then the generator cut out. 3 days later, Dr. Mercer was found wandering barefoot outside the ruins, muttering verses in a tongue no one could identify. The scroll was gone. The academic world was shaken, but quietly so. The Israeli Antiquities Authority imposed a media blackout. No photos, no press, but fragments of whispers reached the Vatican, where Cardinal Matteo Benedetti, guardian of the Secretum Secretorum, recognized the signs. He summoned Dr. Miriam Voss, a theological cryptolinguist with a reputation for finding meaning where others found madness. She was flown under false identity to Jerusalem, briefed in a windowless chamber beneath the Tower of David. There are references, the cardinal said, to a gospel that predates Genesis. Miriam wasn't superstitious. She believed in language, in root forms and etymological pathways. But what she found on the recovered fragments, retrieved from a smuggler's vault in Amman, shook her convictions. The scrolls spoke not of creation, but of containment. A war before time. Entities sealed beneath rivers of salt and stone. A covenant, older than any religion, kept not by faith, but by silence. And worse, they referenced watchers. Not the familiar Nephilim myths, but something different. These weren't fallen angels. They were curators, jailers, prisoners. The Vatican moved fast. Too fast. Miriam and her notes vanished 2 weeks later. Her apartment was stripped bare, books gone, computer wiped. All that remained was a single phrase scrawled into her mirror with crimson lipstick. Who reads awakens what sleeps. A month passed. Then a video surfaced. Low quality, shaky. Uploaded anonymously to a hidden server on the dark web. It showed a woman, gagged and terrified, sitting in front of a wall covered in ancient script. A voice, electronically distorted, asked her to translate one word. Zaphon. When she did, the screen went black. A whisper followed. The gate opens when the name is spoken. Enter Agent Raphael Cassian, a former Vatican field operative turned skeptic. He'd been retired for years, living in Portugal under a new name. But when his old contacts turned up dead, each with a symbol carved into their palms resembling a 7-pointed star wrapped in thorns, he knew something had been unleashed. He broke back into the Archive of Shadows, deep beneath Castel Gandolfo, where the church kept the relics it refused to acknowledge. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Miriam's last report referenced coordinates in the Jordan Valley, and a monastery built atop a cave system never fully mapped. There were only 3 monks left at the site, and they were waiting. Cassian traveled under the cover of night. The journey felt wrong from the start. The air was dry, but the walls of the ancient tunnels wept moisture. He passed carvings along the stone, wingless figures bound by chains made of words, sigils older than Sumeria, and a phrase repeated endlessly. Do not read aloud. He reached the inner sanctum. There, beneath an altar carved from black obsidian, lay a sealed vault, etched in gold-leafed letters that shimmered in the torchlight. Beside it, a single scroll, unrolled. Open, the seal broken. Cassian didn't touch it. He only looked. And some looked back. He awoke 36 hours later, miles from the site, clutching a stone etched with an unfamiliar rune. He couldn't remember how he escaped, but he did remember the voice. A voice inside his head, whispering truths not meant for human ears. A code, a name, a location. He checked into a hostel in Petra and began translating what fragments he retained. And with every line he deciphered, patterns emerged. Mathematical, architectural. A language of structure, not speech. The scroll wasn't a message, it was a blueprint, or a prison, or a door. As Cassian dug deeper, he noticed a disturbing trend. Ancient structures around the world, Göbekli Tepe, the Hypogeum of Halsaflieni, the Osirion, shared similar geometric foundations. Not similar by style, identical, as if designed by the same architect, across thousands of years. And each contained references to the voice before Babel, a force so ancient it predated language itself. The scroll was not sacred text, it was containment protocol. And now it was unraveling. Then came the message. Not through email, not through a call, but through a dream, shared by a dozen scholars across the world. Each reported seeing the same thing. A black sun rising over a desert of glass. A tower made of living bone. And a voice singing in reverse.
In a panic, Cassian contacted the last name on Miriam's list, Dr. Hannah Kadesh, an exile from the religious establishment who'd written forbidden commentary on the scrolls years ago, banned by 3 countries for theological instability. He found her living in Istanbul, under heavy sedation, drawing the same symbol over and over, ring of fire with 7 breaks. She looked at Cassian and whispered, "When the 7th seal is translated, there will be no language left to stop it." Cassian didn't sleep that night. He couldn't, because the whisper had returned. And this time, it knew his name.
Cassian had always trusted his mind. Now it was turning against him. The voices were no longer whispering. They were chanting, layered and rhythmic, forming structures he could almost diagram. He jotted symbols furiously into a battered notebook, each page forming spirals, fractals, blueprints. But blueprints for what? In Istanbul, Dr. Hannah Kadesh had vanished from her flat. No signs of struggle. Only a single item left on her bed. A glass vial filled with crimson sand. When exposed to light, it cast shadows in the shape of ancient Hebrew letters. Cassian recognized the word. Shamayim. Not just heaven, the firmament. A barrier. Back in Rome, something strange was happening. In the Vatican Apostolic Library, entire codices were vanishing, not stolen, but erased, as if they'd never existed. Librarians noticed blank spaces on shelf indices, gaps in digital archives, even fingerprints on books that no longer had pages. Then one night, security footage caught something impossible. A man in robes walked through the sealed library doors without opening them. His face was blurred in every frame. His hands glowed faintly. He stood before a locked vault, placed a finger to the air, and every lock clicked open in sequence, in reverse. The next morning the vault was empty, and written on the wall in ash were the words, "The architect is returning." Cassian was running out of time. The blueprint encoded in the scroll was spreading, replicating through symbols, dreams, even sound. He sought help from Elias Mercer, the same archaeologist who had discovered the first scroll before his breakdown. Mercer, institutionalized in Switzerland, hadn't spoken a coherent sentence in 6 months, but when Cassian entered the ward, Mercer stood upright, locked eyes with him, and whispered. The scroll wasn't meant to be read, it was meant to be sung. He reached under his mattress and produced a crudely etched disc of bronze, covered in ancient markings and musical notations in an unrecognizable scale. A score, not for an instrument, but for the voice. Cassian returned to Istanbul with the disc. There, he discovered something buried beneath the Hagia Sophia, sealed beneath stone and forgotten by history, a secondary chamber marked with inscriptions in Aramaic and Old Greek. Inside was the sarcophagus, and inside that, a body. Not preserved, not decomposed, alive. It opened its eyes. They were black. The being didn't speak, but Cassian felt a surge of imagery rush through his mind. A tower in the desert, 7 figures standing in a circle, a melody that unraveled thought, then a final phrase, burned into his mind like fire across parchment. The 7th utterance unbinds the architect. Cassian stumbled backward, pulling the disc from his pocket. The moment it left his coat, the figure recoiled, screaming in a voice that shattered the glass above them. The disc was a key, but also a muzzle. Across the world, signs were appearing. Birds circling ancient ziggurats in geometric formations. Tremors beneath long-dead temples. Children speaking dead languages in their sleep. And in Israel, a sinkhole opened near Qumran, revealing a chamber never previously discovered. Within it, a scroll, wrapped in human skin. Experts refused to open it. But they didn't need to. That night, every researcher on the excavation dreamt the same words. We are the prison, you are the door. Cassian followed the trail to Prague, where a secret society known as the Custode Orbis was said to guard the last cipher-stone relic capable of translating the architect's language. He infiltrated their sanctuary hidden beneath the old synagogue. The chamber was shaped like an octagon. In the center sat a black pedestal, and atop it a sphere of obsidian humming softly. As he approached, the stone cracked open, revealing a scroll of gold thread, weaving itself into symbols mid-air. But the guards arrived too quickly. He fled, escaping through the catacombs as the chamber collapsed behind him. He got out, but not alone. Something had followed him. In a quiet hotel room in Vienna, he watched in horror as the mirror fogged over despite no steam or heat. Words appeared slowly, as if drawn by an unseen hand. We remember Babel. Then came the whisper. Not from the mirror, from inside him. Cassian's body began rejecting spoken language. He'd try to speak English or Latin, only for incomprehensible syllables to pour out. His voice was adapting, changing to something older. He had become a conduit, and the architect was listening. He contacted a linguist from Egypt, Dr. Leila Nawari, who had once postulated that the root of all language was a vibrational code buried in the structure of DNA itself. Her paper had been dismissed as fringe science. Now, it was their only lead. They met in Alexandria, inside the ruins of the Serapeum. There, Leila revealed an ancient tablet unearthed weeks ago. On it were 7 symbols, and the last was still glowing faintly, thousands of years later. She called them the sigils of unmaking. Cassian recognized the 7th. It matched the rune on the stone he'd found after touching the original scroll. As if rejecting this reality, suddenly Leila convulsed. Blood ran from her nose. She tried to speak, but her jaw locked. Her eyes rolled back. And then she whispered, in perfect clarity. The architect was never sealed, only forgotten. The torchlight extinguished, the shadows thickened, and in the darkness they heard footsteps. But neither of them were moving. Cassian turned toward the exit. Too late. The last thing he saw was the stone tablet melting. Anson awoke in silence. No pain, no memory, just a vast whiteness. The world around him was colorless, suspended between dream and death. And in front of him stood a boy, no older than 10, eyes black as coal, skin cracked like sun-baked clay. He extended a hand. "Your voice is not your own," the child whispered. "Return it or be claimed." Suddenly, Cassian jolted upright, gasping for air. He was back in the Serapeum. Alone. No Layla. No tablet. Only the faint smell of ozone and charred stone. On the wall behind him, something new had been carved. Recently, but by no hand he could see. "When the voice is heard in 3 tongues, the tower will rise." The next clue came from the most unlikely of places. In southern Jordan, a boy named Yusef had sketched a tall, spiraling tower surrounded by 7 shadows. Each held a scroll. Each bled black ink. No one taught Yusef to draw like this. And no one could explain the language he scrawled at the bottom, glyphs identical to those in Cassian's notebook. Yusef's family said he began sleep-speaking after the tremor near Qumran. His eyes remained open while he did it. Sometimes, he wept. Not from fear, but from something deeper. Remorse. Cassian traveled to Jordan and met the boy. Yusef stared at him, as if recognizing him from another lifetime, then quietly said, "The architect knows your pattern now, you cannot hide." The family grew uneasy. That night, the boy vanished. Only a smear of ink remained on the wall, and a circle burned into the earth outside their home, exactly 7 feet in diameter. Cassian followed a lead, whispered to him in a dream, coordinates etched in starlight across an infinite sky. The numbers led him deep into Wadi Rum. There, buried beneath meters of red sand, a metallic resonance rang out beneath his feet when he walked. Not natural, constructed. He assembled a team of archaeologists under a false UN commission. After 3 days of excavation, they uncovered something astounding: a perfectly preserved ziggurat, buried upside down, as if dropped from the heavens head first. At its pinnacle, now its deepest point, was a chamber sealed in obsidian. Inside, a mural covered every inch of wall, depicting scenes of impossible scale. Cities hanging upside down in the sky, human forms made of pages weeping ink, a throne atop a spiraling tower that reached beyond the stars. And at its center the same phrase repeated, "The architect writes reality." As Cassian approached the mural, the room grew colder. Breath fogged, and then time skipped. His watch blinked forward 4 minutes. The entire team froze, conscious, but paused. Only Cassian moved, only he heard the sound. A slow, mechanical grinding, like the turning of a celestial gear. Then a whisper returned. "You are the final scribe." He touched the wall. Instantly, the room dissolved. He stood in a library with no end, books stacked miles high, floating in darkness. Shadows moved along the spines, and one by one, books began to erase themselves. Cassian opened one. It was his childhood. Another picked his mother's memories. Each page, as he turned it, vanished behind him, until he came to a single tome, wrapped in chains, sealed with 7 wax sigils. The word that unmade. He reached out, and awoke again, this time in a hotel room in Jerusalem, covered in sand. The glyphs on his skin were now growing, spreading up his arms and across his chest. He was becoming a vessel. Worse, others were changing too. In Germany, an entire choir went silent mid-performance. When they opened their mouths again, They sang in a harmonic language that shattered stained glass and caused dozens to seize. The song? A perfect match to the disc Mercer had uncovered. The melody was returning. The seals were breaking. Cassian was contacted by an anonymous source, codename Obadiah. The voice was modulated, but the message was clear. There are still guardians, but not for long. Obadiah sent coordinates to a location beneath Mount Nemrut in Turkey. There, under the statues of forgotten kings, Cassian found an entry tunnel buried by time. The descent took hours. The air grew thicker, the silence deeper, until finally he entered a colossal dome carved from a single piece of stone. At its center stood an altar. On it, 7 keys, 7 names, 7 corresponding tunes, unopened. But one was cracked open. Not from outside, but from within. Cassian lit a torch. The tomb held no body, only feathers. Black, massive, charred at the tips. And beside them, a fragment of the golden thread scroll. He read the first line aloud without thinking. The torch extinguished, and in the blackness, he heard his voice repeat the line back to him. Not as an echo, but as a question, as if the architect was listening through him. Back above ground, his phone rang. It was Obadiah again. You've read too far, you'll begin forgetting now. Cassian didn't respond. He couldn't remember what the voice had just said. His memories were fading, not from his mind, but from existence. Photos in his phone were disappearing. Names no longer triggered recognition. Only one phrase remained etched in his mind, burned too deep to forget. When the final tongue is silenced, the tower will rise. Cassian stood at the edge of the Mediterranean, watching the stars flicker unnaturally. They were moving, not across the sky, but rearranging, forming a symbol. The same 7-pointed sigil carved into Mercer's hand. And then he heard it again, that melody, faint, rising from the deep, a sound that had no source, a song older than language. The waters parted. A spire of black stone rose slowly from the ocean floor, covered in glyphs, crying mist. The tower was real, and it had been waiting. The tower groaned as it rose from the sea. Not a sound of stone, but of something alive. The black surface bled mist that shimmered in shifting runes, symbols that rearranged faster than the eye could track. Waves parted unnaturally around it, and lightning crackled in silence above its peak. Cassian stared in disbelief from the shoreline. The melody, the one he'd only heard in visions, now hummed from the tower's surface, a song not heard but felt, resonating through bone. Then the screaming began. All across the port city, people fell to their knees. Their mouths opened wide, but no sound came out. Cassian watched in horror as words poured from them like breath made solid. Faint wisps of written language, dissolving in the air. They weren't speaking. They were being emptied. Cassian ran. Back inland, back to silence, back to the last name that hadn't yet been erased from his mind. Dr. Layla Navari. Somehow, impossibly, she was still alive. Hidden in the Sinai desert, Layla had cloaked herself in a bunker wrapped in ancient copper scrolls, etched with protection glyphs too old to translate. She spoke to Cassian through a glass partition. Neither trusted words anymore. Instead, they drew circles, eyes, towers wrapped in chains, and a phrase Layla wrote with trembling hands. You spoke the first key. Cassian froze. Layla looked up. You sang it in the ziggurat. That room wasn't for observation, it was an amplifier. The scroll had never been a record. It was an instruction manual. At night, Cassian dreamed. He stood atop the tower. The world below was silent, frozen in a moment between collapse and rewriting. In the sky above, books burned in reverse, ashes reassembling into ancient volumes. At the center of it all stood a throne of bone and brass. On it sat a figure wrapped in pages, face obscured by ever-shifting letters. The architect. And in a voice that did not echo, it said, "The seventh utterance is near, but you only know 6. When Cassian awoke, a sigil had appeared on his chest, burned into his skin. Layla gasped. She flipped through one of her protection scrolls, pointing to a matching symbol. "That's the gate rune. You're the conduit now." He was no longer just a seeker. He was the mechanism, but for what they still didn't understand. Then came a message, coded in biblical numerals, broadcast through radio waves across 3 continents. It repeated only one sentence. "Gather them, 7 must sing." Cassian and Layla scoured the globe for the remaining 6 individuals. Each one was already changing, marked by the architect's influence. One man in Kyoto had stopped sleeping. Instead, he etched glyphs into wood for hours without memory. A woman in Nairobi sang in frequencies that warped camera footage. A child in Norway, deaf since birth, began hearing things no one else could, and writing them in blood. They found 5, the 6th remained hidden. Time was collapsing. In Tehran, they discovered a buried temple carved into a mountain, older than the city itself. At its heart, a mirror pool that reflected not the viewer, but their original self. Cassian looked in. The image wasn't human. It was light-shaped into thought, a being made of will, bound in form. The message was clear. You were never born, you were written. Reality was a book, and someone had begun rewriting it. They gathered the 7 at a location known only in whispers, the Vault of Babel, hidden beneath the ruins of the ancient city of Eridu. The site was protected by a language, one that twisted any who entered without permission into endless repetition. Layla solved it by silencing her thoughts completely, breathing through prayer. Inside, a spiral staircase descended deep into a chamber lined with 7 empty thrones. Above each, a glyph pulsed. The architect's plan was complete. They were to become the new script. Cassian stood at the center of the chamber, holding the golden thread scroll. The others formed a circle, their bodies glowing faintly, each radiating a different frequency. Layla began the chant. One by one, they joined her. The room thrummed. Reality buckled. And then, Cassian forgot his name. He stood in a room that didn't exist, built from concepts, not stone. In front of him, the architect waited. It no longer wore symbols. It was the symbol, and it spoke one last truth. You thought the tower was rising, but it never fell. Cassian reached for the scroll. It burned into his hands, etched into his very structure. He screamed, but the sound was inverted, rewound. And in that moment he understood. This wasn't a prison. It was a reset. Back in the desert, Layla opened her eyes. Cassian was gone. So were the other 6. The thrones were filled by no one. But far above, in the sky, the stars blinked again, this time in rhythm, a language, a pulse. And across the world, children began drawing the tower in their sleep.